Hi, I'm Dina. Welcome to WORLDwrite. For this programme, we have asked a group of volunteers to present their views on the conflict in Syria and pose questions to Karl Sharro. Karl Sharro is a commentator and a writer on the Middle East who has kindly agreed to respond to volunteers' views.
Pictures have emerged today apparently showing members of the Syrian army defecting to join protesters in the city of Homs.
Hi, my name's Henna, and the issue I'd like to raise is whether there are any alternatives to the West intervening in Syria. Every day we hear stories of brutalities carried out by Assad's regime, and the rebels appear to be fighting a very one-sided battle. The military outnumber them and are much better equipped with tanks and heavy arms. Western intervention is clearly not the answer because freedom for the Syrians must come from the Syrians themselves. But Karl, are there alternatives to Western intervention that can assist the Syrians in their fight for freedom?
Hannah, I really understand where you're coming from, and I think it's not easy to watch those videos and hear the news about what's happening in Syria and not be moved by it, and to a certain extent have this pressing question, what ought we to do? But again, here in these circumstances, and I always emphasize this when I'm talking about the subject, there's a difference between genuine solidarity and a form of moral superiority that sees ourselves as the savior, and perhaps here in the West. And under the pretense of helping people, we might end up doing more damage than not. There are different forms of alternatives to Western intervention that have been flaunted, including perhaps regional and countries and neighbors of Syria intervening, or the formation of so-called humanitarian corridors. What this ignores is any form of intervention in that form will likely be subject to the desires and the outcomes that those regional players will want. And in the case of things like humanitarian corridors, ideas that sound very good in the abstract, they will certainly involve some form of military intervention, will introduce friction, and will force people to take sides within Syria. And ultimately, having done that, will end up inflaming more the military potential and the violence within Syria itself. So we really need to consider very carefully, why do we have the right to do anything, putting the question of solidarity aside, which are the different avenues for exploring.
My name is Francis, and I don't see how, in Syria, a nation controlled by a militant minority, there can be any alternative for Western nations outside of intervention. Al-Assad's regime has responded to people protesting against his bans on free expression and websites promoting such freedoms like Facebook and Twitter by violently torturing and killing perpetrators and innocent civilians alike. Peaceful protests were met with bullets outside of Dara. Entire cities were destroyed for allegedly housing rebels. 13-year-old Hamza al-Khatib was abducted, tortured, and his dead body returned a month later, exhibiting non-fatal bullet holes through the arms and the belly, electrically induced burn marks, whip lacerations, a cut-off penis, and a broken neck. These abominations cannot stand. Immediate action is necessary. What is your response, Karl?
Francis, to be honest, this is extremely absurd. I don't see how you can move from the fact of those excesses that are being committed in Syria and the fact that we need immediate action, and I assume that you're insinuating or clearly asking for a Western intervention. I don't see how you specifically made that correlation. I mean, let's just go back a few years, and the American withdrawal from Iraq actually only happened at the end of last year, and we've seen all sorts of atrocities that have happened due to the presence of the American government in Iraq and the occupation of Iraq by the American government. And we have seen the excesses that the American soldiers have committed on every single level. And that should be always in the back of our mind whenever we say we're going to go in bombs a-blazing into these situations and sort them out. We need to understand the history. We need to understand the calamitous results of our interventions on those parts of the world without even understanding what the real dynamics are, and following and believing and hyping up opposition groups, particularly in Iraq, that had no legitimacy, no credibility on the ground, no organic foothold whatsoever, and the absolutely disastrous consequences for not only for Iraq, by the way, but for all these Western soldiers that have died over there. You really need to ask yourself, Is it really as you are portraying it? Is it a question of atrocities committed by the Syrian regime will be stopped by any form of Western intervention, as you seem to be insinuating?
Hi, I'm Ingvild, and I think we should consider the responsibility to protect principle, which was invented as a response to Rwanda's genocide. If a state fails to uphold its responsibility to protect its people from crimes against humanity, the international community should then take this responsibility. I'd like to know, what do you think about this, Karl? Is interfering worse than prolonging a conflict with too many casualties? When do political considerations prevail over humanitarian concerns? If the international community decides that it has no responsibility to protect the people of Syria, what happens? Could we in the future be talking about Syria the same way that we today condemn the UN's inaction in Rwanda 18 years ago?
Honestly, Ingvild, I don't think we need to wait 20 years. In fact, we're making those same analogies now. And I think without wishing to go too much into the situation of Rwanda or sometimes any of the other countries in the Eastern Europe, particularly in Yugoslavia and the siege of Sarajevo, that are used as a parallel, this parallel is being made now to say we need to be intervening in Syria in order to stop the murder. And like those situations in Africa and Eastern Europe, the problem wasn't that the West wasn't intervening and completely turning a blind eye. The West was actively intervening for decades, arming certain groups in the region, scheming and plotting to organize military coups and certain forms of taking over control. And particularly in Syria, when you look at the history of Syria, and this is by no means a conspiracy theory, there's very strong historical evidence and documents that I have revealed that show particularly the American role in Syria. We can't just again pretend that all of that didn't happen and we now live in a post-political era in which all major Western governments take their decisions purely on humanitarian consideration, and then they become the saviors of the day when the responsibility to protect is brought into play. I think we need to be more critical and we need to challenge this kind of narrative that is being projected by Western governments and critics that and commentators that believe in their take. We need to be very careful in this moving away from a genuine political understanding of the world into a humanitarian reductivism that ultimately ends up in us seeing the others as helpless victims that are always constantly in need of our help.
Hi, my name is Anna, and as a social activist with a great interest in human rights, I have some grave concerns about what has been happening in Syria recently. Assad's regime is brutally silencing protesters for democratic change. The numbers of people being reported killed are seriously upsetting, and the Western media and state leaders are discussing the possibility of a Western military intervention. However, such interventions in the past have never been known to take place purely for preservation or restoration of peace. In your opinion, Karl, what really motivates the West?
Thank you, and again, I think it's a really interesting question. That is a very legitimate question to ask at this point in time. What does really motivate the West? In a lot of the interventions that have happened over the past 10 or 20 years, there's always this insinuation that there are some very narrow interest-driven reasons for intervention, and people seem to talk about oil and things like that and trade. In fact, when you examine that, it's not to rule out the possibility that the West had some obvious interest in securing or supply of oil or establishing trade or anything like that. But I think when you really examine the language of the leaders, Western leaders, when they advocate intervention, particularly in the case of Libya, how can anyone say it was about the oil? Because here was a regime that the West was using. Very obviously, it was sending detainees to be tortured over there. It was having its oil supply uninterrupted coming from Libya. They had brought back the leader in from the cold and rehabilitated him. They had established trade with him. Obviously, if it was purely about interest, I would argue the rational position for the West at that time was not to intervene at all and allow Gaddafi to regain control and everything would go back to normal. But there is something that troubles Western leaders now in that their sense of legitimacy and their ideas about how they go about projecting themselves in the world and their sense of image, there's a real crisis in there. Whenever this concept of humanitarian intervention resurfaces, it's always tied back to this desperate attempt at gaining some sort of legitimacy and credibility at the world stage that seems to be missing at home. So putting in that perspective, we need to consider those historic developments that have forced or kind of pushed Western leaders into taking a less than rational, self-interested examination of geopolitical order, but rather into jumping into completely unpredictable moves that seem to be precisely aimed at gaining some form of credibility. And this is even more dangerous than traditional forms of imperialism. This is more catastrophic ultimately because precisely it's not driven by any rational considerations. It's unpredictable, it's damaging, and it needs to be opposed.
Hi, I'm Azra. I wonder how we'd feel in this country being told what's best for us and finding our land littered with bombs in order to save us and give us democracy. And why does it have to be achieved almost overnight? South Africans spent many years chipping away at a despotic regime and are slowly determining their own futures. Each place is unique. I'd like to ask you, Karl, based on regional, political and social history, how would Syrians best determine their own futures?
On Azra's point, I think it's very important at the moment to clarify what is really happening in Syria and what needs to happen for genuine political change to take place. The necessity over here is for the formation of a broad, unified, politically clear form of organization and political leadership that will ensure Syria's path towards revolutionary change and seeking freedom is controlled away from the calls for Western intervention or the pleading for outside help. This will help ensure that the participation of broader segments of Syrian society in an uprising that's still in the process of finding its feet will ensure that the Syrians' call for freedom and for determining their future is not hijacked by outside authorities and remains within their own aspirations and expectations for the future.
My name is Barbara, and in the light of recent lessons from history, Karl, how do you think Syria should be advised to attempt to secure and sustain peace, and what role could peacekeeping forces have?
Well, Barbara, I think the important point to address here is what is precisely the role of the United Nations, which is broadly seen as a good organization that wants to establish peace in the world. But a critical examination of that will reflect, particularly in this particular stage of the Syrian uprising, that the aims of the United Nations or the international community, particularly through the peace plan of Kofi Annan, are towards peace, not towards change, which is the driver over here in the uprising over Syria. The United Nations aspirations for this peace, so-called peace, would be about laying the arms and halting the dynamic of a movement that could have led for a better future and still might lead to a better future for Syria. So we need to be very careful in equating between an oppressive regime and people that are demanding change and asking for them to get into some sort of dialogue, and worse, equating them in this balance as if they are engaged in a war and we are trying to introduce peace and prevent bloodshed. So I think we really need to be careful for the United Nations initiatives and Kofi Annan's plan not to become a way for restricting the opposition in Syria. And we're already hearing calls for the opposition to stop its demonstration, its peaceful demonstrations, which will be ultimately a big blow towards this momentum for change.
And they are going to work with me and the other members of the council to ensure that the 6-point plan is implemented.
Hi, I'm Chidi Ogundu, and I'm beginning to wonder about the actual role of the Syrian National Council. They do not seem to be doing much for the Syrian people.
Chidi, I think you're asking a very important question over here, and we have a problem from the beginning of the uprising and the emergence of the SNC and its acceptance as a legitimate representative of the uprising in Syria by Western nations and the international community in general, when in reality it has very little control on the ground in Syria. And this is particularly one of the main problems with the dynamics of the uprising, the Syrian uprising, in that there's a willingness on the street to take a lot of risk and for people to risk their lives in their pursuit of freedom and self-determination, while their so-called leadership is absent abroad and doesn't even come back into the country and hasn't even established mechanisms for conveying political organization and structures and directing the path of the Syrian uprising. Let's remember that very importantly, with any ambitious uprising of this scale, what is needing an ability to determine strategy and tactics, an aspect that seems to be entirely lacking from the way the SNC conducts itself, and the activists on the ground and trying to compensate for that, which in my mind exposes the failures of the SNC and points more importantly for the need for the local activists themselves to take the lead and determine their own future.
Hi, I'm Richard, and I want to put it to you, Karl, that Britain and France have used Syria as a proxy for their own power struggles for 100 years, and have clearly had a strong influence in the wider region too, from the Crusades onwards, which has contributed to the current disastrous situation. Nevertheless, I believe Britain now has a responsibility to take a clear stance, whether by acting or choosing not to act. There is no way to remain neutral to avoid taking sides. How do you think British foreign policy should address this issue, Karl?
Richard, I can't help but say this. There's a fundamental paradox in what you're saying, in that in the one sense you identify the real problem in Western French and British meddling historically in the region, and then the desire for a clear position that is almost based in an abstract world in which we make ethical decisions, which is not exactly the situation on the ground. For example, until very recently, Western governments broadly, and specifically the British governments, were happy to take Bashar al-Assad into the fold and to establish all kinds of ties with him and all kinds of links with him. And if we remember perhaps the role that his father played in the Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait, he was given license, for example, to invade Lebanon as a reward for that. So the role of Britain specifically in the region has always been mired in these narrow geopolitical considerations. But I think what is very different now is the attempt to redress all of that in purely humanitarian considerations, which I think without a doubt is completely insincere. We can't just assume that Britain hasn't been intervening in the region, hasn't been intervening in Syria actively, and now take a position based purely on abstract ethical consideration. What we ought to reconsider, and if we're specifically concerned with British foreign policy, is how that foreign policy is conducted, what was informing it in the past, how can we challenge that today from within Britain towards the creation of a more productive foreign policy, but one also that looks after Britain's broader interest, not narrowly defined interest abroad, and to go away from the abstract language of humanitarianism, because that's certainly, as history has shown, not the prime motivator for any British government.
The sickening thing is the complete merciless nature of this bombing.
Hi, I'm Christine. I'd like to highlight the media's role in the Syrian conflict and the issue of balanced, fair and accurate reporting, given that Western journalists have been denied access into Syria itself. A recent article I read said the Western media's unquestioning, consensual, biased and melodramatic coverage of the Syrian events risks moving this conflict to a full-blown war with grave consequences for the Syrian people and the region. I'd like to know your views, Karl, on this statement and whether you think this is an accurate assessment of the Western media's reporting on Syria.
I think, Christine, that's actually a very interesting question, because there are lots of battles that are being fought on this media landscape, so to speak, and it's almost becoming a form of propaganda war. And there's no doubt that there are Western and regional media organizations that are engaged in that in a very blatantly kind of biased way, and they're exaggerating perhaps sometimes or giving coverage to certain aspects of the Syrian uprising and not to other aspects of it. But I think what is at danger over here is the ethos of the media and of journalism that seems to be lost within this picture. Because we have seen the rise of what is described as the journalism of attachment, and this is particularly relates back to the Eastern European wars in the beginning of the 90s and other places over the world, where the role of the journalist is not finding out the truth anymore, but actively taking sides. And that's a very slippery slope that is happening, and we see the wider projection of that being played on our screens today. And I myself would even question the need for, regardless of the fact whether those, I call them the atrocity videos, there's quite a lot of them that are actually true and they're filmed in the moment, and there's horrible examples of that. I would question the need for this sustained dosage of exposure to those videos, as if we can't develop a sense of solidarity and understanding of the dynamics of the situation without this constant exposure to bloodshed in all its goriness, which tend to make the issues more emotional. I would argue differently, that we as human beings are able to understand circumstances with their broader complexities rather than just that one angle. Of course, massacres needs to be explored and kind of explained to the world and all that kind of thing, but we need to always ground it in a non-emotional, rational understanding of the dynamics of the situation, and that is my big problem of this development of this genre of media reporting.
They were exterminated.
Hi, I'm Vivita, and I'm concerned about the financial cost of Western military intervention in Syria. Would we be involved in paying for the killing of Syrian soldiers? Because we know for a fact that the Eurozone is in crisis and the US and UK economies are in recession. So how does the government find money for a war when it does not have funds to spend on its own people? Are they planning to raise taxes from the people, or cut their spending further, or are they expecting the Syrian people to pay? What is your opinion on this, Karl?
Well, Vivita, I think it's always surprising to me, and particularly in Libya, that when there's a need for war, Western governments seem to find the money somehow magically, and they always make the claim, and we've heard that in Libya, that that doesn't come from any other source of funding, let's say public services or anything like that. And it actually exposes a certain aspect in this willingness to go send the bombs and send the planes in to bomb any nation. We somehow seem to overcome all our financial limitations. I wouldn't push it to say this should be one of the main objections to why would we have a principled position against Western intervention, but it's certainly a paradoxical aspect, again, that exposes the incoherence in how Western leaders seem to project this sort of idea of why they are intervening, and at times it goes against other aspects that they are trying to uphold, such as policies of austerity, for example, and lack of financial means. So I wouldn't say it's a central objection to the question of intervention, but it's certainly one worth considering.
My name is Gentina, and I'm interested in the reporting on the unrest in Syria. In many situations, access to the internet, phones with recording and filming devices have enabled ordinary people to take up certain roles they may not have been able to without these new technologies. Citizen journalism, it can be argued, has become a new platform for providing information that traditional journalists have not had access to or were not around to report. Should we, Karl, in the light of journalist Maria Colvin's death in Syria, in order to prevent such casualties in the future, look towards citizen journalism as a primary source of informing us in conflict areas where journalists are denied access?
Thanks, Gentina, and really, again, very interesting question. I think very important distinction to make here. There's a difference in the profession of journalism between providing raw information and putting that within a coherent interpretive narrative. What we get from citizens journalism today is this constant supply of information, which we did have in traditional media, but what we really miss is the authoritative voice, the analyst who's able to understand the situation and give their take on it. And that never says that that authority means that we have to accept it, but as in with any narrative that has its internal coherence, we can choose to critique it and we can choose to engage with it and ultimately come up with our own answers. That ethos of journalism is being defeated by this flooding us with a constant supply of images, mostly images, that is to say, that we struggle most of the time to control and assess and produce any coherent interpretation of. And to my mind, that's a very dangerous development. It's leading to the decline in that professional journalistic ethos, we can't throw away all this history of decades and perhaps centuries of professional journalists putting their lives at risk in order to report the truth. But that's the important point to keep in mind. They are reporting the truth, not reporting a particular political angle that needs to be supported, which is the danger, again, in being seduced by the images that come out of citizen journalism that request predominantly an emotional response, and one that sees people as victims, not deciders of their own fate.
My name is Julian, and I would like to hear more debate about the ethical side of intervention in another country. Because once you intervene in another nation's affairs, you irrevocably change their cultural and historical evolution. Throughout history, intervention has delivered disasters to the nations who have been helped or invaded in the name of justice and democracy. Conflict only breeds more conflict. Simple cause and effect. It is the rule of escalation. The West gives the rebels more firearms, so the Syrian military deploys more snipers. The West gives the rebels tanks, the Syrian military start using planes. The West gives the rebels missiles, Assad bombs the rebels with a nuke. Where does it end? Where exactly does the bloodshed end and peace begin? In fact, Karl, is it ever okay for one nation to intervene or interfere with the sovereignty of another nation? And can armed intervention by an outside element into an internal crisis ever be justified?
Listen, Julian, I'm not dogmatic about the subject of intervention. Perhaps in certain circumstances, I can be turned around and convinced that some forms of intervention are probably justified. What I need you to keep in mind is the historic and political interpretation of intervention. Where I'm wary of one of the points you had in your question is you sort of make it too anthropological, as if there's a pure, clear path of development that's completely untarnished, and as soon as it's touched by any foreign body, then it will be polluted and we'll never put it back on track. Now, the reality of human existence is never that simple. We live in a globalized world, interests are kind of intersecting, and there's all sorts of consideration to take into to remember. Now, we have to be careful of that, what I call the anthropological attitude, in that it seems to imply that there isn't a universal human unifying aspect that can override all these cultural differences. That's why when opposing intervention, we need to oppose it on political grounds, not any form of cultural or anthropological considerations as if we can't relate to any other culture. There again, I would ask the question, in any intervention, what is the reason for it, what is justification, and what are the aims? And this is really the kind of questions we need to be asking. So I think you sort of took it too far in an extreme in kind of highlighting this cultural, perhaps, specificity that is inaccessible to others, and I think that's a step too far in opposing intervention.
With their NATO allies, Turkey a member of the alliance, and of course one of the fundamental principles of NATO is that if one member of the alliance is attacked, all of the other members of the alliance step in.
My name's Rachel, and I wanted to focus on the countries local to Syria. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not the West should intervene in the conflict. Do you think, Karl, that the neighbouring countries to Syria have a role to play with regards to this conflict, in light of the fact that any outcomes are likely to have a greater impact on them as neighbours and trading partners? If so, is this intervention any more legitimate than Western intervention?
Thank you, Rachel. Very, very interesting question, but also very timely in the development of our understanding of what's happening in Syria and around Syria and possible intervention. We've been hearing recently and reading many articles that are discussing this particular role for Turkey within Syria and a possible intervention there. It was sparked off by a small incident on the Turkish-Syrian border, and there's speculation that incidents like that might drag Turkey in. But also there's a certain analysis that says that a possible NATO intervention in Syria might take the path of a Turkish intervention because of certain clauses in the NATO charter, but as well because of agreements between Syria and Turkey that might make that legal between codes. And where I stand on this is I'm opposed to any form of regional intervention as well as any broader Western intervention. I mean, to start from the beginning, 3 of the 4 countries around Syria and that is Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, don't have the capability of intervening in Syria, and any sort of blatant intervention will drag them into a struggle that kind of may end up being very problematic for them. So that particular Turkish role will inevitably lead to NATO stepping onto the scene. And regardless of whether the Turkish intervention itself is legitimate or not, where we need to see it at the moment in this paving the way for a possible NATO role in Syria, and particularly this idea that's being trumped up at the moment of humanitarian corridors that are very naively discussed as if they will not incur some form of military intervention and they will not implicate other actors in the region. So again, I think we need to be very wary of initiatives like that and the possible implications that they will have in internationalizing the conflict in Syria and bringing more actors into the situation.
Hi, I'm Shreya, and I want to know more about what caused the Syrian uprising. The Syrian government has claimed that it is not a sectarian government. However, there are many indicators which suggest that it could be. In 1982, at the height of a 6-year Islamist insurgency throughout the country, Assad conducted a scorched earth policy against the town of Hama to suppress the uprising of the Sunni Muslims. The ruling party in the country are mostly comprised of Alawites, who are in actual fact a minority, as 3/4 of the civilians are Sunni Muslims. So Karl, are civilians angry because of the dictatorship, or is it because they are ruled by a minority?
Shreya, very interesting question, and it will help us shed the light on the dynamics of the Syrian uprising itself. I think we need to be very careful from how this word sectarian is used, especially in Western analysis of the situation broadly in the Levant and the Middle East, and particularly in Syria. There's a tendency to reduce everything to sectarian dynamics when the failure in understanding the political dynamics emerges. What I need to say about Syria is, imagine a situation in which one ruling party that has controlled public life for 4 decades, and when the father dies, the president, his son, who's never been in public life before, takes control. That should be an indication of the injustice and the kind of the situation that Syrians live under. I would very clearly say that the uprising started as a cry for freedom and a cry for liberty, and Syrians wanting to take more of a stake in the running of their own country. Now, what has happened over the past year is, in the absence of a formation of broader political organizations that can speak for Syrians and to Syrians broadly, the sectarian element has come to the front. But let's not assume that this is a deterministic process. When sectarianism comes into play, it doesn't mean that everything will unravel and this will become entirely a sectarian process. Not at all. What is needed at the moment is for that sense of political aspiration and political organization and having aims and goals that can rise above those petty sectarian considerations, can put the process back on track. And certainly there are lots of people that are engaged in that, and that's a very reassuring aspect of the development of the Syrian uprising. So what I would advocate is, again, I will use that word anthropological. Let's not be anthropological towards the Middle East and assume the sort of what we would call an inherent tribalism that manifests itself in sectarianism will suddenly take over and become a process that is irreversible. The Syrian people still have it within their reach to actually flip the table and kind of produce that form of political organization that will allow them to achieve democracy and freedom.
My own question: why, if other countries have gained citizenship through war and developed themselves after war, as for example Eritrea and Ethiopia did, without the help of Western countries, why do Western countries now feel the need to intervene in Syria? Why do you think, Karl, they see Syrians as so incapable of dealing with the situation themselves?
I think that's a very interesting question, Dina. But I think the problem is what's happening now in the West's reaction to Syria is not only a specific attitude towards Syrians themselves. There's been an overall attitude that's developed over the decades towards people that live in other countries about their ability to shape their future by themselves. But particularly in Syria, I think the West is caught in this moment where it feels there is some kind of geopolitical interest that it tries to justify to itself in Syria. And some people, for example, trump the idea that the fall of the Syrian regime will weaken Iran within the region. So that there's an attempt at kind of creating some sense of geopolitical benefit for a Western intervention in the region, but the West appears to be still reluctant to intervene. However, all that diagram that it's being described about what the benefit of intervention in Syria is seems to be really very tenuous. It's partially a response to an idea developed by Western elites themselves about a danger of the Iranian regime that has been pushed way out of any proportion. And it's a character of understanding of Iran, and it's a character of understanding the region. So I think what is more dangerous perhaps at this moment than the attitude towards the Syrian people is this over-exaggeration and cartoonish look in looking at stereotypes of evil dictators and bad extreme governments that is really reductive. We want to ask ourselves, is this really how we want our governments to understand other regions and political developments within them? And is that really what should be informing their foreign policy decisions? I think we're looking at a complete collapse in a rational understanding that's becoming very reductive and therefore very unpredictable and consequently very damaging.
Hello, my name is Rosso. I think Western intervention would hasten the overthrow of Assad's regime. However, this would mean the new government, whatever form it takes, incurs a debt to the West. In Afghanistan, for example, Hamid Karzai's government is more concerned with serving Western interests than that of the Afghan people. That said, despite the evident bravery of the Syrian freedom fighters, Assad commands one of the most well-equipped armies in the world, with 500,000 men at his disposal. So, Karl, apart from lending our moral support, is there anything we can do as individuals to aid the rebels without compromising Syrian sovereignty?
Rosa, I'm not quite sure about the best or most well-equipped army in the world, or one of the most well-equipped armies in the world. I think it's certainly a large army, and it does have lots of sophisticated, particularly Russian-made weapons. But we've seen that taunted in the past in the case of Iraq, for example, where it was overhyped and it was said it was the fourth largest army in the world and it would be completely difficult. And obviously it was defeated by the Western alliance led by the United States very quickly, twice within 15 years. Now, where I would like to focus on this is there's always this analogy with particularly the Spanish Civil War that is discussed in the concept of, fair enough, I'm a Western person who's concerned about the situation in Syria, but I don't like our governments to intervene over there, nor I would like them to invade. But what can I do as an individual? And a lot of people bring up the example of the international brigades that fought in the Spanish Civil War. And I think actually you can't propose that sincerely today without it sounding a bit kind of ridiculous, to be honest. And that points to something very important. The dynamics of any possible international struggle, any possible form of international solidarity seem to have completely disappeared. So now it will be seen as a complete joke, whereas it was taken very seriously at the time of the Spanish Civil War, and it was also seen as a very important step in fighting fascism. These are the kind of questions we actually need to be asking ourselves today. Why has this happened to the world? Why is it even more acceptable for governments to go in bombing away than for freedom-loving individuals to actually go and support their brothers and sisters in another country? And I think this is what we have to take from your question, really understanding why those dynamics have changed historically.